Ahoy hoy, this is Michaela from Team Retro, where we like retro games, we like roguelikes, and we like the devices that bring them to us. After a few days in FedEx limbo, my OLED Switch finally came in, and I immediately started playing Metroid Dread on it. Now, Metroid Dread is the fifth 2D Metroid game in a series of games that date back all the way to the very first Metroid on the NES, which means that there is over 30 years of storyline in this quintology to play if you are interested in the entire lore of the Metroid series. And some of these games have been remade by Nintendo. One was actually remade by a fan and then shut down and then remade again by Nintendo, and we'll talk about that in this video. But the entirety of the 2D Metroid series of games can be played on a retro device of your choosing. So in this video, I wanted to showcase which retro devices you can play the Metroid games on, depending on your budget, but then I also wanted to showcase the best Metroid games to play leading up to Dread, so that you can actually get the best experience possible playing these prequels on handheld devices. And one of the things I really liked about playing the Metroid series from the beginning was that Marvel movie-like feel of just replaying these masterpiece games and just enjoying this story that's told with very little dialogue and mostly gameplay. And the Metroid series is one of my favorite Nintendo series just because the gameplay is challenging and engaging, and even though there are frustrating moments, it really is just an enjoyable time to sit and explore and fight and figure out this story that spans for generations now. So not only am I going to go through the games in this video, but I'm also going to go through some of the best retro devices to play these games on, depending on what you are willing to spend. However, I'm also going to go over the best option if you don't want to buy any retro device and you just want to use your Nintendo Switch. So as much as it is hard for me to resist right now, I'm going to put down Metroid Dread, and we're going to go ahead, jump into it, and let's get started. So first, let's talk about the various systems that the Metroid games have appeared on over the years. You had the Nintendo Entertainment System, the Nintendo Game Boy, the Super NES, the Game Boy Advance, and the 3DS. Now for this particular video, we are leaving out the Prime series, which appeared on Nintendo GameCube, Nintendo Wii, and Nintendo DS. And then there was that Nintendo 3DS spin-off with the Federation that nobody likes to talk about, so we're not going to talk about that either. So we'll get back to this infographic in a minute, but for now, let's showcase the different games that appeared on these systems. So first we have Metroid for the Nintendo Entertainment System. Here I'm playing on my Ambernic RG300. And this obviously is the first game in the series, and you would think logically that this would be the one you would want to tackle first. However, this particular version of Metroid is actually very hard, and it is a little dated considering it came out on the NES, and you're not going to have an experience in future Metroid games that you have with this one. So I actually don't recommend that you play the original Metroid unless you're up for the challenge and you want to see what the original game looked like back in 1986. The reason I would say that this is a little too hard is there's no maps, it's very easy to get lost, and some people have actually recommended getting a pencil and paper and hand drawing the maps as you go, or looking up a strategy guide or a walkthrough. Instead, if you want a more consistent Metroid experience, I actually recommend that you go to the Game Boy Advance version of Metroid Zero Mission. Here I am playing Metroid Zero Mission on the RG351P, and I recorded this footage while spending time with my dog, so if you hear some random collar shakes or dog barking in the background, that would be Frankie doing what Frankie does. But getting back to the game, Metroid Zero Mission is a pretty faithful remake of the original Metroid, however with the quality of life improvements that came with Super Metroid on the SNES, like the map and some added power-ups that weren't in the original game. And there's some added storyline in here as well, so while you're going to get a better experience and you're going to get the original story, you're also going to have just a better experience playing this game. And if you happen to be playing it on an Anbernic RG351P, you're actually also preserving the aspect ratio of the original Game Boy Advance. And this is actually what I played instead of going back to the original when I wanted to play through these games again. Now, when it comes to part 2 of the side-scrolling Metroid saga, you actually have a few options here. So the first one would be going to the Game Boy and playing the original Metroid 2 Return of Samus. And unlike the original Metroid, this is actually a pretty fun original version to play. When I was recording footage, I actually got lost a little bit in the gameplay and actually recorded more footage than I needed just because I was actually enjoying playing this game. I actually really enjoyed going through Metroid 2 as a kid, where I didn't really enjoy the first Metroid. However, you still have some issues with quality of life. There's no map, and the difficulty is still higher than some of the newer Metroid games. And it does happen to look a little dated. So again, I would only recommend that you go through this version of the game if you want to see what the original was like, and if you are up to the challenge, and if you also like hand drawing your maps. Now, depending on the device that you choose to play these games on, you have some better options where Metroid 2 is concerned. If you have an RK3326 device running custom firmware like ArcOS, you actually have access to a port called AM2R Return of Samus, and this wasn't officially made by Nintendo. This was a fan game. However, a great love and attention was actually put into remaking this game by the fans, and it reuses a lot of the Game Boy assets. And even though it's not made by Nintendo, this is a very enjoyable way to play Metroid 2. Now, while I haven't played through the entire game, from what I have experienced of this game so far, is it looks like it's attempting to be faithful to the original Metroid 2 Return of Samus on the Game Boy. However, it's also looking to bring in some of those quality of life improvements, like being able to grab the ledges and having access to a map screen. You also get improved sound effects and an improved soundtrack. The soundtrack actually sounds really good in this game. However, if you have access to a Nintendo 2DS or a Nintendo 3DS, you may instead opt to play the official Nintendo remake of Metroid 2, which is called Metroid Samus Returns. And they all tell the same story of Samus on SR388 versus the Metroids. But Metroid Samus Returns is probably going to give you the best experience when it comes to graphics and gameplay. And on top of that, this game is made by the same developer that made Metroid Dread. So if you're playing these games to prepare for Metroid Dread, this game is going to give you the next closest gameplay because it has the melee counter and it has the Eon abilities, which do make a return in Metroid Dread. However, 3DS and 2DS systems are getting harder to find and are going up in price. So if you don't want to pay for one of these devices, you don't want to modify one of these devices, or you want one of the Anbernic or other retro devices, then AM2R is definitely a good second place as far as what to play for Metroid 2. So for Metroid 3, the only option is absolutely the best option, and that's Super Metroid for the SNES. And if you were to choose only one game in this series to play, I would make it this one. This is a timeless game that is absolutely 100% a masterpiece between the soundtrack, the story, the level, and the power ups and the gameplay. This game has no equal other than perhaps Dread, which was just released. And even then, I have to finish playing Dread before I actually make the conclusion that Dread is better than Super Metroid because I'm only a couple hours into Metroid Dread, so in my eyes, Super Metroid is still the best of the 2D Metroids. It's a title that I played as a kid, it's a title that I still play as a grown up, and it's very near and dear to my heart. And this will play pretty much on every device I am showcasing today. And we'll get into this game a little bit toward the end of this video, but for now, let's just leave it at Super Metroid is an absolute gem of a title. And finally, Metroid 4 is only present in one game, which is Metroid Fusion. So this game is probably not as good as some of the other ones mentioned before, like Super Metroid, but they do attempt some new things in this game which are interesting, like the use of data rooms and navigation rooms with a computer that kind of tells you what to do. This game is a little bit more linear, and it actually is harder to sequence break, but it's still a fun game in its own right. The story is interesting, and it's definitely worth a playthrough if you have one of these devices. If there's one criticism I have, it's the robot who tells you what to do. He is kind of annoying. I get his relevance to the story, but I really feel like this probably could have been left out and the narrative could have been driven without it. And unfortunately, this is a game aspect that returns in Metroid Dread. And I guess we'll deal with it for now, but that's the one thing I was not a fan of with Metroid Fusion. However, this game did have some pretty amazing bosses, and the idea of being on a space station instead of a planet was very interesting. It was definitely a very different take for the Metroid series, and I still recommend a playthrough even if you are remotely interested in this game. And this is a Game Boy Advance game, so again, if you happen to be playing this on an Anbernic RG351P, you have that 3:2 resolution, which preserves the exact aspect ratio of the Game Boy Advance. Alright, let's go back to our infographic and let's fill in all the logos of the Metroid games I covered in this video. And we're actually going to take the system logos out of the image because we're going to start talking about the devices that can play these games. And let's start with the Anbernic RG300. Now, this device is considered a lower-end retro gaming device and has a starting price of about $50 depending on where you shop for it, and it can play these Metroid games. So you have your choice between playing the original Metroid or Metroid Zero Mission, but unfortunately when it comes to Metroid 2, your only option is the original Game Boy version. Next, let's talk about the RK3326 devices, and we'll start with the Anbernic RG351P. And this device has a starting price of about $100 depending on where you shop, and it can play all the same games as the RG300. However, this also has support for the AM2R port. And the RG351P also does Game Boy Advance at its native resolution, so Metroid Zero Mission and Metroid Fusion will look amazing on this device. But you also have a couple of options of devices that utilize this same chipset. For example, the RG351M has a similar body style to the RG351P, but it has an aluminum metal shell and built-in Wi-Fi for $20 more. Then you also have the Anbernic RG351V if you're interested in keeping that Game Boy style form factor. And this device has a starting price of about $110 depending on where you shop. This device also has a 4x3 screen, so the Game Boy Advance games might not look as great, but the NES and SNES games will look amazing. So in the end, you'll have to decide how much you're willing to spend and which resolution you prefer. Now getting into the pricier devices, you could opt for the newly released RG351MP. Now this device has a metal aluminum shell, it has the 4x3 screen that the RG351V has, but it has the vertical form factor of the RG351P and the RG351M. And starting price for this unit is about $150. And finally in this price range is the Powkiddy RGB10 Max. And this device is more like a Switch Lite as far as screen size is concerned. It'll play all the same games as the Anbernic devices, so really you would only want to invest in this one if you want that bigger screen. And there are more expensive devices you can get that run Android that can possibly emulate 3DS and all that, but I wanted to keep this video limited to retro devices that are under $200. Now with that, let's talk about the potential of a new Nintendo 3DS. Now unfortunately, the starting price for a pre-owned 3DS system right now is about $150, but I've seen them on eBay and other reseller sites for about $200 to $220. However, if this is a route you really want to go with, or you already have one of these systems kicking around, it can play these Metroid games. The first 3 Metroid games can be purchased through Virtual Console, while Metroid Samus Returns is a native 3DS game. If you are using a 3DS system out of the box and you don't have a new 3DS, then you will not be able to play Super Metroid. SNES Virtual Console didn't actually show up until the new 3DS systems came about. However, if you modify your 3DS system with custom firmware, and I did publish a video a couple weeks ago on exactly how to do that, you actually open up your system to be able to do Game Boy Advance injection, and then you can add Metroid Zero Mission and Metroid Fusion to your list of playable games on this device. Now let's talk about one last option, and this is what a good friend of mine would call the path of least resistance. And that would be if you decide that these devices aren't for you and you don't want to spend any extra money and you just want to utilize the Nintendo Switch that you already have that you're playing Metroid Dread on. And if you utilize the Nintendo Switch Online service that gives you access to NES and SNES games, you will be able to play the following Metroid games. And if this is the situation you're in and you don't want to spend any extra money on one of these retro handheld devices, then what I would actually suggest is you actually only play Super Metroid before playing Metroid Dread, because in the beginning of Super Metroid you will get a synopsis of Metroids 1 and 2, and then at the beginning of Metroid Dread you'll get a synopsis of Metroid Fusion. So it does catch you up with the story enough to get you into Dread and get you going. And that'll do it for this video. We've been talking for almost 20 minutes about the various 2D Metroid games that have come out since the 1980s, and which ones are the best ones to play and which ones are the best devices to play them on. And if you are in the market for one of these retro devices and you are interested in playing the 2D Metroid series from the beginning, hopefully this video was informative for you and helped you make a decision on how to best proceed on playing these amazing and timeless games. And now that I finally have the OLED Switch in my hands, look for some impressions videos and look for me showcasing some retro games and some roguelikes on this new device. Thank you so much for watching, and if this video was helpful to you in any way, please be sure to like and subscribe. Until next time, bye for now, don't stop believing, and let's go save the galaxy.